In the remote valleys of Afghanistan's Hindu Kush, a weathered tour guide leading local civilians was about to face his worst nightmare. A peaceful mountain crossing turned deadly when Taliban forces under Mullah Faheem emerged from hidden positions, blocking all escape routes. Raymond Chief Navarro wasn't your typical civilian contractor. For 20 years he was Force Recon Marine and Special Operations instructor, known for leading the legendary Ghost Walker missions during Operation Enduring Freedom. When Mullah Faheem's fighters surrounded the group, they had no idea they were facing a master of mountain warfare. Navarro's strategic withdrawal into the cave networks would trigger a 3-day game of cat and mouse that would reshape the entire region's power dynamics. What began as a simple civilian escort would become a defining moment in counter-insurgency operations. The Hindu Kush valleys would never be the same after the night Chief Navarro turned the hunters into the hunted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the harsh mountains of Afghanistan, where loyalty is tested and brotherhood forged in fire, a story unfolds that would forever change the lives of 6 individuals bound by duty, conflict, and the unforgiving nature of war. What drives men to stand their ground when death whispers from every shadow? How does one measure the weight of responsibility against the cost of sacrifice? Staff Sergeant Ray Chief Navarro had always known this day would come. The relentless pursuit by Mullah Faheem's forces had led to this decisive moment on a windswept ridge, where the fate of his wounded men hung precariously in the balance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, each one potentially concealing an enemy fighter waiting to strike. Navarro's weathered features betrayed no fear, though his mind raced with concerns for his team. Lieutenant Marcus Kane lay wounded behind a cluster of rocks, his previous dismissiveness of Navarro's combat experience replaced by a newfound respect, born of desperation. Their relationship had been strained from the start, with Kane's by-the-book approach clashing with Navarro's battle-tested instincts. Now, as Kane fought to remain conscious, those differences seemed trivial against the backdrop of survival. Corporal Jamie "Doc" Teague worked feverishly to stem the bleeding from Kane's wound, her skilled hands moving with practiced precision, despite the chaos around them. She had always served as the unit's emotional anchor, but today her medical expertise meant the difference between life and death. Through the years, she had formed a unique bond with Navarro, understanding his leadership style that prioritized people over protocol. PFC Ahmed A.J. Jalil maintained his position on their right flank, his knowledge of the local language and customs proving invaluable even in combat. The young soldier had faced constant scrutiny from Kane due to his Afghan heritage, but Navarro had recognized his potential from day one. Now, Jalil's ability to interpret the enemy's movements gave them a fighting chance against Mullah Faheem's superior numbers. Sergeant Deshaun Brooks, Navarro's most trusted soldier, coordinated their defensive position with mechanical efficiency. His journey from being Navarro's mentee to his right-hand man reflected years of shared experiences and mutual trust. Brooks had initially viewed Jalil with suspicion, but combat had a way of erasing prejudices when lives depended on each other. The tension peaked as Mullah Faheem's voice carried across the ridge in a mix of Pashto and broken English, his words, designed to break their resolve. The warlord had pursued them relentlessly across 3 provinces, turning what should have been a routine patrol into a desperate fight for survival. His forces had picked off their radio operator 2 days ago, leaving them isolated and cut off from support. Navarro's mind flashed to the events that had led them here, the ambush that separated them from their main force, the grueling march through hostile territory, and the impossible decisions he'd had to make along the way. Each choice had carried its own weight, each step guided by his responsibility to bring his people home alive. The dynamics within the group shifted as their situation grew more dire. Doc Teague divided her attention between Kane's deteriorating condition and monitoring the others for signs of combat stress. Brooks maintained constant communication with Jalil, their earlier mistrust dissolved by the necessity of cooperation. Kane, despite his incapacitation, observed these interactions with a growing understanding of what true leadership meant. Mullah Faheem's psychological warfare intensified, specifically targeting Jalil with accusations of betrayal to his heritage. The young soldier's hands tightened on his rifle, but his loyalty remained unshaken. Navarro had taught him that honor wasn't bound by nationality, but by the choices one made and the people one protected. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became another enemy to contend with. Water supplies ran low, ammunition counts dwindled, and the window for potential rescue narrowed with each passing hour. Yet within this group of diverse individuals, a singular purpose emerged: survival through unity. Their differences, once sources of tension, transformed into complementary strengths. The ridge had become their last stand, a place where past conflicts and prejudices held no meaning against the immediate threat of annihilation. How would they hold out against overwhelming odds? What sacrifices would be demanded of them before this day ended? The answers lay in the bonds they had forged and the leadership that had brought them together as they faced their greatest challenge under the unforgiving Afghan sun. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the tactical operations center as Lieutenant Marcus Kane stood before his platoon, his pressed uniform a stark contrast to the dust-covered soldiers seated before him. Staff Sergeant Chief Navarro watched from the back of the room, his weathered features masking the concern growing in his gut. Something about this mission felt wrong from the start. Intelligence reports indicate increased Taliban movement in the Korangal Valley, Kane announced, his pointer tapping against the map. Our objective is simple: conduct reconnaissance of these 3 villages and identify any insurgent activity. The lieutenant's clinical delivery betrayed his inexperience in the region, a fact not lost on the veterans in the room. Corporal Jamie Doc Teague exchanged knowing glances with Sergeant Deshaun Brooks. They'd been through enough missions to recognize when the brass was missing crucial details. PFC Ahmed Jalil shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his intimate knowledge of the local dynamics setting off warning bells. "Sir," Navarro finally spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of 6 deployments. "Those villages are under Mullah Faheem's influence. Moving through that territory without proper support." Kane cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Your concerns are noted, Staff Sergeant, but this comes directly from battalion. We move out at 0400. The dismissal was clear, but the tension it created was palpable. After the briefing, the men gathered in small groups, their hushed conversations carrying undertones of apprehension. Doc Teague approached Navarro, medical, pack slung over his shoulder. "Chief, you thinking what I'm thinking?" Navarro nodded slowly, watching PFC Jalil in deep discussion with Brooks. The young Afghan-American soldier's family had fled the Taliban years ago, and his presence on this mission could either be their greatest asset or their deadliest liability. How would the local population react to one they might view as a traitor? Brooks broke away from his conversation with Jalil and joined them. "Kane's gonna get us killed, Chief. He doesn't understand how Faheem operates." The sergeant's loyalty to Navarro was unwavering. Built through countless firefights and close calls, "We work with what we've got," Navarro replied, though his mind was already racing through contingency plans. What were they missing? Why was Battalion pushing for this mission now when tensions in the valley were at their highest? Lieutenant Kane stood alone by the map, his rigid posture betraying the weight of command. Despite his outward confidence, doubt crept into his expression as he studied the terrain. He'd heard the stories about Mullah Faheem, the shadow that haunted the valley. Would his leadership be enough to guide these men through what lay ahead? The relationship dynamics within the platoon shifted like desert sand. Kane's prejudice toward Jalil created a subtle rift that threatened unit cohesion, while Navarro's natural leadership drew the men together despite their differences. Doc Teague moved between these factions like a ghost, tending to both physical and psychological wounds with equal skill. As the men prepared their gear for the morning mission, questions hung in the air like smoke. What intelligence wasn't Battalion sharing? Why was Mullah Faheem allowing such obvious troop movements to be observed? The pieces didn't fit, and in Afghanistan, missing pieces got men killed. The sun would rise in less than 6 hours, bringing with it a mission that would test every relationship, every assumption, and every man's will to survive. In the Korangal Valley, trust was as valuable as ammunition. and as the platoon would soon discover, both could run out at the worst possible moment. Who would prove loyal when bullets started flying? How would Kane's leadership style hold up under the pressure of actual combat? And most importantly, what was Mullah Faheem planning in the shadows of those 3 villages? As Navarro made his final rounds checking weapons and equipment, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would change everything. The complex web of relationships within the platoon would either strengthen under fire or shatter completely. There would be no middle ground, not in the Korangal Valley, not with Mullah Faheem watching their every move. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just their military training, but the very bonds that held them together as a unit. In the hours before dawn, each man faced his own demons, knowing that when the sun rose over those mountain peaks, everything they thought they knew about loyalty, leadership, and survival would be challenged. The village elder's weathered face creased with concern as PFC Ahmed Jalil translated his words, each syllable carrying the weight of generations of local wisdom. Staff Sergeant Navarro watched intently, noting how the elder's hands trembled as he gestured toward the valley's shadowy depths. What secrets lay hidden in those ancient passages that could make a hardened mountain dweller quiver? Chief, he says the valley has claimed many souls, Jalil explained, his usual confidence wavering. The Taliban use the caves, but there's something else that concerns him more. The young interpreter paused, searching for the right words to convey the gravity of the message. Lieutenant Kane shifted impatiently, his boots crunching against the rocky soil. We don't have time for local superstitions, PFC. Get to the point. The dismissive tone in Kane's voice drew a sharp glance from Doc Teague, who had been quietly observing the exchange while checking his medical supplies. Sergeant Brooks moved closer to Navarro, his voice low enough for only the staff sergeant to hear. Chief, something's off here. The elder's too scared to be making this up. Navarro nodded imperceptibly, having learned through 3 tours that local intelligence, however cryptic, often meant the difference between life and death. Jalil continued translating, his voice growing more urgent. He says the valley changes at night. The caves have many entrances and the Taliban know them all. They appear and disappear like ghosts. The elder reached out suddenly, gripping Jalil's arm with surprising strength, his next words causing the young soldier to pale slightly. What else, AJ? Navarro prompted, using Jalil's nickname to ease the tension he could see building in the young man's shoulders. The relationship between them had grown from mere professional courtesy to genuine trust over the past months, despite Kane's persistent skepticism of Jalil's loyalty. He says there's a commander, Mullah Faheem. The elder claims he's different from the others. He studies his enemies, learns their weaknesses before striking. The valley is his hunting ground. Jalil's translation carried an undercurrent of dread that even Kane couldn't ignore. Doc Teague stepped forward, her medical instincts picking up on the elder's physical signs of distress. Ask him how recent the Taliban's activities have been. The question revealed her tactical awareness, honed by years of treating casualties and understanding the patterns of insurgent behavior. The elder's response came in a torrent of Pashto, his hands gesturing animatedly toward the setting sun. Jalil listened intently, his expression growing more troubled with each word. The translation that followed would later prove prophetic. They've been watching us since we entered the valley. Mullah Faheem never strikes immediately. He waits until his prey feels safe, until they make mistakes. Brooks unconsciously tightened his grip on his rifle, scanning the rocky outcrops above them. How many eyes were on them at this very moment? The thought sent a chill through the gathering, despite the afternoon heat. Kane cleared his throat, clearly struggling between his instinct to dismiss the warning and his responsibility for the platoon's safety. Staff Sergeant, your assessment? The question revealed a crack in Kane's usually rigid command structure, a subtle acknowledgement of Navarro's experience. Navarro took a moment before responding, weighing the elder's warning against their mission. Parameters. The intelligence they'd been sent to gather suddenly seemed far more complex than a simple reconnaissance operation. What if the valley itself was the trap? Sir, I recommend we adjust our approach. The elder's warning aligns with patterns we've seen in other regions. Mullah Faheem's tactics sound sophisticated, We'd be wise to assume he's already gaming out our likely moves. Navarro's response was measured, professional, but carried an underlying urgency that the platoon's veterans immediately recognized. The elder spoke again, softer this time, his eyes fixed on the deepening shadows of the valley. Jalil's translation came slowly, each word carefully chosen. He says we must leave before darkness falls. In the night, the valley belongs to the ghosts, both the living and the dead. The warning hung in the air like smoke, raising questions that would haunt them in the hours to come. How had Mullah Faheem transformed this ancient valley into such an effective weapon? What unseen preparations had he made for their arrival? And most crucially, had their presence already triggered a trap from which there would be no easy escape? Afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley floor as Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro studied the peculiar arrangement of stones along their patrol route. 20 years of combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about these markers set off alarm bells he couldn't ignore. They weren't natural formations. Someone had placed them deliberately, using an ancient system of communication that many modern soldiers would miss. "Chief, we need to keep moving," Lieutenant Kane called from the front of the formation. "We're losing daylight." Navarro held up his hand, signaling the patrol to halt. He'd seen similar trail markers during his first deployment to Afghanistan, simple patterns that local fighters used to guide their allies and mislead their enemies. But how could he explain this gut feeling to a commanding officer who valued efficiency over caution? Deshaun Brooks moved closer to Navarro, his eyes scanning the terrain. The young sergeant had learned to read his mentor's body language over their months together. "What are you seeing, Chief?" Before Navarro could respond, PFC Jalil approached, his expression tense. The Afghan-American soldier had been unusually quiet since translating the elder's warning about the valley. "Those stones," Jalil said softly. "They're arranged in the old way. My grandfather used to tell stories about how the Mujahideen marked paths during the Soviet War." Lieutenant Kane's boots crunched against the gravel as he strode back to their position. "We don't have time for local folklore, PFC. The Cobb is expecting us back before nightfall." Doc Teague, who had been observing the exchange while checking his medical supplies, spoke up. "Sir, with respect, Chief Navarro's instincts have kept us alive more than once. Maybe we should hear him out." The tension between Kane and Navarro crackled like static electricity before a storm. Their different approaches to leadership had created a rift that widened with each passing day. Kane relied on standard operating procedures and textbook tactics, while Navarro understood that survival in Afghanistan required a deeper understanding of its people and their ways. "Look at the spacing," Navarro explained, pointing to the stones. "They're exactly 3 paces apart, too precise to be random. And see how they're slightly tilted toward the east? In the old system, that's a warning. Multiple fighters ahead." Kane's jaw tightened. "And you learned this from where exactly? Some classified course they don't teach at officer candidate school?" "From the same people who've been fighting in these valleys for generations," Navarro replied evenly. "The same ones who drove out the British, the Soviets, and anyone else who underestimated them." Deshaun Brooks shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on his rifle. He'd witnessed enough of these confrontations to know how they usually ended, with Kane pulling rank and Navarro being proved right later, often at a cost. Jalil knelt beside one of the markers, his fingers tracing the weathered surface. "There's more," he said. "The way these smaller rocks are clustered, it's like coordinates. They're telling their people where to position themselves for an ambush." Doc Teague moved closer to examine the stones, her medical bag swaying at her side. "So we're walking into a trap?" "We've been walking into it for the last kilometer," Navarro confirmed. "These markers are old, but there are fresh ones too. See the disturbed dust? Someone's been updating them within the last few hours." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Even Kane couldn't dismiss the evidence before them. But what were their options? Turning back meant mission failure, while pressing forward could lead them straight into Mullah Faheem's carefully laid trap. If they're marking the trail, Brooks wondered aloud, why not just destroy the markers? Navarro shook his head. Because then they'll know we spotted them. Right now we have the advantage of surprise. They think we're blind to their signs. The sun dipped lower behind the mountain peaks, painting the valley in shades of amber and shadow. Time was running out, and they needed to make a decision. Would they trust the warning written in stone, or dismiss it as superstition and continue their march into what increasingly looked like a carefully orchestrated ambush? What none of them realized was that high above, hidden in the rocky crags, Mullah Faheem's spotters were already tracking their movement, waiting to signal their forces. The real question wasn't whether there would be an attack, but how the platoon would respond when it came. Would Kane's by-the-book leadership prove sufficient, or would they need Navarro's hard-earned understanding of Afghanistan's ancient ways to survive what lay ahead? The scorching Afghan sun had barely crested the mountain peaks when Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro's concerns about the trail markers evolved into a heated tactical debate. The morning briefing, usually a straightforward affair, transformed into an arena of conflicting leadership philosophies between Navarro and Lieutenant Marcus. "Kane, those markers weren't there by accident, sir," Navarro insisted, his weathered features taut with conviction. "The enemy's reading our movements like a book." He gestured to the crude map spread across their makeshift command post, pointing out the pattern of disturbed stones and altered pathways he'd documented over the past 48 hours. Kane's dismissive scoff drew concerned glances from both Doc Teague and Deshaun Brooks, who stood at opposite corners of the tent. "You're seeing ghosts, Staff Sergeant. We have reliable intel suggesting the insurgents are concentrated 30 clicks north of our position." The tension between the two leaders had been building since their mission began, but this moment crystallized their fundamental differences. Navarro's decades of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, while Kane's reliance on official intelligence channels reflected his more conventional military education. PFC Ahmed Jalil, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. "Sir, if I may?" His voice carried the weight of his unique perspective as both a soldier and someone who understood the local customs. "These markers Chief's talking about, they're similar to what tribal hunters use to track prey in these mountains." Kane's jaw tightened at Jalil's intervention, his inherent bias showing through his professional veneer. But before he could respond, Doc Teague spoke up, her medical kit clutched close as always. "Lieutenant, we've lost 3 good men this month following standard protocols. Maybe it's time to consider alternative perspectives." The mounting pressure within the command tent mirrored the broader tensions plaguing the unit. Deshaun Brooks, ever loyal to Navarro, shifted uncomfortably. As he watched his 2 superior officers lock horns, the young sergeant had witnessed firsthand how Navarro's unconventional tactics had saved lives. Yet he understood the chain of command demanded respect for Kane's position. "With all due respect, sir," Navarro continued, his voice steady despite his frustration, "Mullah Faheem isn't playing by any rulebook we've studied. He's adapting, learning our patterns. These markers, they're his way of showing us he's always one step ahead." The mention of Mullah Faheem's name changed the atmosphere in the tent. The insurgent leader had become more than just an enemy target. He'd evolved into a shadow that haunted their every move, a ghost who seemed to anticipate their strategies before they executed them. Kane paced the length of the command post, his boots leaving distinct impressions in the dusty floor. The weight of command pressed down on his shoulders, and for a brief moment, his facade of unwavering certainty cracked. "What exactly are you proposing, Staff Sergeant?" This subtle shift in Kane's stance didn't go unnoticed by the others present. Doc Teague and Jalil exchanged quick glances, while Brooks straightened his posture, sensing the potential for a breakthrough in the ongoing power struggle. Navarro moved to the map, his fingers tracing alternative routes through the mountainous terrain. "We need to change our patterns, sir. Split the unit into smaller, more mobile teams. Use the landscape to our advantage instead of following predictable patrol routes. Most importantly, we need to start reading these signs instead of dismissing them." The proposal hung in the air like the dust particles dancing in the rays of sunlight that penetrated the tent's canvas. It represented more than just a tactical adjustment. It was a fundamental challenge to the established military doctrine that Kane had built his career upon. The lieutenant's response would define not just the next phase of their mission, but the very nature of their unit's internal dynamics. Would traditional military hierarchy prevail, or would the harsh realities of asymmetrical warfare force an evolution in their approach? The lives of every soldier under their command hung in the balance, waiting for resolution to this clash of leadership styles. The evening settled over the Afghan mountains like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an unsettling stillness that made Doc Teague's skin crawl. As she moved through the makeshift aid station, checking on the wounded from their latest engagement, her trained eye caught more than just physical injuries. The psychological toll of constant vigilance had begun to wear on everyone, manifesting in subtle ways that only a seasoned combat medic could detect. PFC Jalil sat quietly in the corner, methodically cleaning his weapon while stealing glances at the radio. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, Doc noted, but from the weight of responsibility. As their primary interpreter, he carried the burden of bridging two worlds, each increasingly hostile to the other. How long before that pressure reached a breaking point? Staff Sergeant Navarro appeared at the entrance of the aid station, his weathered face betraying the exhaustion he tried so hard to conceal from his men. Doc had known Chief long enough to read the concern in his eyes, even as he maintained his commanding presence. Their silent exchange spoke volumes. Both recognized the calm wasn't natural, but neither wanted to voice their apprehension and risk spreading anxiety through the ranks. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sergeant Brooks entered next, supporting a young private who'd twisted his ankle during their hasty retreat from the last firefight. Doc noticed how Brooks positioned himself between Kane and Jalil, a subtle but deliberate move that spoke to the underlying tensions within the unit. The sergeant's protective instincts had evolved over their deployment, extending beyond his immediate team to encompass the entire platoon, even those he'd initially distrusted. Lieutenant Kane's absence from the aid station spoke as loudly as his presence would have. The officer had retreated to the command post, ostensibly to coordinate with headquarters, but Doc knew he was wrestling with the weight of his earlier clash with Navarro. The lieutenant's leadership style, born from textbook training rather than combat experience, continued to create friction at the worst possible moments. As Doc wrapped the private's ankle, her mind wandered to Mullah Faheem. The insurgent leader had been unusually quiet lately, and that silence carried its own menace. What moves was he plotting in the shadows of these ancient mountains? How many more casualties would she have to treat before this game of cat and mouse reached its inevitable conclusion? The quiet was broken by soft conversations in Pashto between Jalil and a local elder who'd sought treatment for his grandson. Doc watched the interaction carefully, noting how Jalil's shoulders tensed when certain topics arose. The young interpreter's face remained professional, but his eyes told a different story, one of increasing concern about information filtering through the local population. Navarro caught it too. The staff sergeant moved closer, seemingly casual but deliberately positioned to hear more. The relationship between Navarro and Jalil had evolved into something beyond mere military hierarchy. They'd developed an almost familial bond, with Navarro's protective instincts extending to shield the young interpreter from both external threats and internal prejudices. Brooks finished securing the last supply crate, his movements precise but agitated. Doc recognized the signs of a soldier who'd seen too many quiet moments shattered by sudden violence. How many more times would they have to patch themselves up physically and emotionally before their tour ended? Or would Mullah Faheem's forces ensure some of them never saw that end? The evening air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from distant villages. Doc completed her inventory of medical supplies, noting with growing concern how their stock of critical items had dwindled. Each engagement with Faheem's forces left them with fewer resources, and resupply missions had become increasingly dangerous as the insurgents tightened their grip on the region. Through it all, Doc maintained her role as the unit's emotional anchor, providing not just medical care but a steady presence that helped hold their fragile team dynamic together. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of impending crisis, not just in bodies, but in minds and spirits. Tonight, every instinct told her they were approaching a breaking point. The only question was whether they would face it as a unified team or fragment under the pressure. As darkness settled fully over their position, the quiet became almost oppressive. Doc Teague finished her rounds, but sleep remained elusive. In the distance, a dog barked. Once, twice, then fell silent. The sound echoed off the mountains, carrying with it a warning that only those who'd learned to read Afghanistan's deadly rhythms could understand. Tomorrow would bring violence. The only uncertainty was where and when it would find them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as Staff Sergeant Navarro watched PFC Jalil fiddle with the radio equipment. Something wasn't right. The usual static and intermittent chatter had given way to an unsettling silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. How could they lose contact so suddenly in an area where communications had been reliable just hours ago? "Chief, I can't get anything," Jalil reported, his fingers dancing across the dials with increasing frustration. "It's like someone flipped a switch. Even the emergency frequencies are dead." Lieutenant Kane paced behind them, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The young officer's jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth, betraying the anxiety he was trying to mask. "Could it be equipment failure?" he asked, directing his question to Navarro rather than Jalil. Sergeant Brooks moved closer to the group, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines above. "Not likely, sir. We checked everything before moving out. Something's blocking us." Doc Teague approached from where she'd been monitoring Private Rodriguez's sprained ankle. Her medical pack swayed against her hip as she joined the impromptu conference. "The timing's too perfect," she said quietly. "First the ambush, then the chase, now this." Navarro nodded, appreciating how quickly she'd connected the dots. The loss of communications wasn't a coincidence. It was the next move in an elaborate game of chess they'd been unwittingly drawn into. But who was really moving the pieces? "Mullah Faheem," Jalil whispered, voicing what several of them were thinking. "He has supporters in every village. The equipment needed to jam our comms. It wouldn't be hard to acquire with the right connections." Kane's head snapped toward Jalil, eyes narrowing. "And how would you know about his capabilities, Private?" Before Jalil could respond, Navarro stepped between them. "Because it's his job to know, sir. We need his insights now more than ever." The tension crackled between the two leaders, but Kane backed down, recognizing the truth in Navarro's words. Brooks moved closer to Jalil, his earlier distrust giving way to professional curiosity. "What else might they have waiting for us?" The young private hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "The valley ahead, it's called the Valley of Whispers by locals. Not because it's quiet, but because secrets pass through it like wind. Messages, weapons, fighters, anything that needs to move unseen." Doc Teague's hand instinctively tightened on her medical pack. "So we're walking into their playground." "More like their hunting grounds," Navarro corrected. He pulled out his map, spreading it across a flat rock. The valley ahead snaked through the mountains like a wound, with countless smaller cuts, ravines, and caves branching off from it. Perfect for ambush, perfect for getting lost, perfect for making a platoon disappear. Kane studied the map intently, his earlier antagonism forgotten in the face of their tactical situation. "We can't go back. The main force behind us is too strong. And we can't stay here," Brooks added. "We're exposed, and night's coming." Navarro traced the valley's path with his finger, mind racing through scenarios. What would Mullah Faheem expect them to do? More importantly, what could they do that he wouldn't expect? "Sir," he addressed Kane, "we need to make a decision. Every minute we stand here is another minute they have to prepare whatever's waiting in that valley." The lieutenant straightened, and for a moment, Navarro saw past the bravado to the weight of command pressing down on the young officer's shoulders. How many decisions could go wrong? How many lives hung on getting it right? "We split up," Kane said finally. "Two teams. One follows the valley floor as expected. The other takes the high ground parallel to the first. If they're waiting to ambush us below, we'll have the advantage of elevation." Doc Teague shook her head. "Splitting our medical resources could be dangerous if either team takes casualties." "It's a risk we have to take," Kane cut her off, then softened his tone. "But you're right. We'll need to distribute the medical supplies between teams." As the group began planning the split, Navarro watched Jalil continue to work the radio, his movements becoming increasingly desperate. The private's expression confirmed what Navarro feared. Whatever was blocking their communications wasn't temporary. They were on their own, about to play a deadly game of hide-and-seek with an enemy who knew every shadow in the valley ahead. Who would emerge from the Valley of Whispers? And what whispers would follow them out? The first shots cracked through the pre-dawn air like thunder, shattering the eerie silence that had blanketed the valley. Staff Sergeant Chief Navarro instinctively dropped to one knee, his trained eyes scanning the ridgeline where muzzle flashes illuminated the darkness. The Taliban's opening salvo wasn't meant to kill. It was a message, a declaration that the hunters had become the hunted. "Contact front." Navarro's voice carried across the radio channels, but only static answered. The communication blackout that had begun hours earlier persisted, leaving the platoon isolated in hostile territory. Lieutenant Kane's silhouette appeared beside him, and for once, the usual tension between them dissolved in the face of immediate danger. Multiple positions, high ground advantage. Kane assessed, his West Point training evident in his tactical analysis. "They've been waiting for us." Corporal Jamie Doc Teague moved swiftly between the scattered members of the platoon, checking their readiness while keeping low. Her medical kit bounced against her side as she reached PFC Ahmed Jalil, who was intently focused on translating the distant shouts echoing across the valley. "They're coordinating through local dialects," Jalil reported, his face taut with concentration. "Mullah Faheem is leading them personally." The revelation sent a chill through the unit. Faheem's presence meant this was no ordinary ambush. It was a carefully orchestrated trap. Sergeant Deshaun Brooks organized the rear security element, his earlier distrust of Jalil temporarily forgotten as they faced a common enemy. The Taliban's firing positions had them nearly surrounded, using the natural terrain to maximum advantage. How had they anticipated the platoon's route so precisely? The question lingered as Navarro implemented their immediate action drill. Years of experience told him they needed to break the enemy's momentum before it fully developed. Brooks suppressed the northern ridge. "Kane, take first squad," and his orders were cut short as a massive explosion rocked the valley floor. The Taliban had seeded the area with improvised explosive devices, further limiting their movement options. Doc Teague rushed toward the blast site where 2 soldiers lay wounded, but Navarro held her back. "Wait for covering fire." Lieutenant Kane's initial hesitation transformed into decisive action. "Second squad, lay down suppressing fire. First squad, bound forward to those rocks." His commands, though textbook perfect, carried an edge of uncertainty that the veterans in the unit detected. The Taliban's fire increased in intensity, suggesting more fighters were joining the ambush. Jalil's continuous translations revealed a disturbing pattern. Mullah Faheem was using the platoon's standard operating procedures against them. Each defensive move they attempted was met with a pre-planned counter. "They knew we were coming," Brooks shouted over the gunfire, voicing what everyone had begun to suspect. "This whole valley is one big kill zone." Navarro's mind raced through their options, each one more desperate than the last. The high ground belonged to the enemy, their communications were dead, and their planned extraction point was still hours away. The rising sun would soon eliminate their last advantage, the cover of darkness. Doc Teague worked frantically to stabilize the wounded soldiers, her trained hands steady despite the chaos around her. "We need to move them soon, Chief," she called to Navarro. "These injuries are serious." The situation demanded immediate action, but the wrong decision would be fatal. Navarro caught Kane's eye, and for the first time they shared a moment of complete understanding. Their petty disagreements meant nothing now. Survival required unity. The Taliban's fire suddenly shifted, concentrating on their northern flank. Through his scope, Navarro spotted movement among the rocks, fighters maneuvering to cut off their last viable escape route. Would they risk a fighting withdrawal through the valley's narrowest point, or stand their ground and hope for reinforcements? That might never come. The decision was made for them as another explosion illuminated the valley, closer this time. Mullah Faheem's voice carried across the battlefield, speaking in English. "Submit or be buried in these mountains, Americans. You have nowhere left to run." The words carried a chilling truth. The platoon was trapped in hostile territory, outmaneuvered and outgunned, with wounded soldiers and failed communications. Yet in this moment of crisis, something unexpected emerged, a unity forged in the crucible of combat, transcending rank and personal differences. The question wasn't whether they would fight. That was never in doubt. The real question was, how would they turn this carefully planned trap into their enemy's grave mistake? As dawn approached and the shadows retreated, the answer would determine not just their survival, but the very nature of their brotherhood. The first RPG streaked through the morning air like angry lightning, detonating against the lead MRAP's armor in a thunderous explosion that showered the convoy with debris. Before the echoes could fade, the valley erupted with automatic weapons, fire from multiple positions. Staff Sergeant Navarro's training kicked in instantly as he bellowed orders through the radio, his voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. Contact left, contact right, multiple shooters on the ridge lines. Navarro's commands carried over the din of battle as soldiers scrambled for whatever cover they could find. The distinctive crack of Taliban PKM machine guns mixed with the sharper reports of AK-47s, creating a deadly crossfire that pinned down several members of the platoon. Lieutenant Kane's voice crackled over the radio, tension evident despite his attempt to maintain composure. Alpha Team, push north, Bravo, establish base of fire. His textbook response to the ambush might have worked on a training ground, but the reality of combat had a way of shredding carefully laid plans. Deshaun Brooks managed to drag a wounded soldier behind their disabled vehicle, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "Chief, we've got 3 men hit," he shouted to Navarro, who was already moving to assess the situation. The metallic ping of rounds striking their armor punctuated every movement. Doc Teague worked frantically to reach the wounded, crawling through the kill zone while bullets kicked up dust around him. His medical bag took a round, spilling precious supplies across the ground. "I need cover to reach Martinez," he called out, his usually calm demeanor strained by the urgency of the situation. PFC Jalil, positioned in the rear vehicle's turret, spotted movement along the eastern ridge. "Multiple tangos moving to flank." His warning allowed Navarro to redirect fire, temporarily checking the enemy's advance. But the Taliban fighters showed unusual discipline, maintaining their positions despite taking casualties. The situation deteriorated as a second RPG found its mark, this time striking closer to the command vehicle. Kane's position became increasingly precarious as the enemy fire seemed to focus on his location. Was this a random concentration of fire, or did the Taliban somehow know which vehicle contained the platoon's leadership? Navarro recognized the tactical sophistication of the ambush. This was no random attack by inexperienced fighters. The enemy had chosen their ground well, using the terrain to full advantage while cutting off potential escape routes. Through the chaos, he caught glimpses of a figure moving among the Taliban positions, directing their fire with practiced efficiency. Could this be Mullah Faheem himself? The wounded continued to mount as the platoon fought to establish a defensive perimeter. Doc Teague's voice carried an edge of desperation as he called for more medical supplies. "We're running low on everything. These boys need immediate evac." The nearest support was at least 20 minutes away, if they could even reach their position through the gauntlet of enemy fire. Brooks organized a fire team to protect Doc's position, but the enemy pressure continued to build. "They're probing for weaknesses," he reported to Navarro. "Never seen them fight like this before." The observation sent a chill through the veteran sergeant. This wasn't just an ambush, it was an elaborate trap, and they had walked right into. Lieutenant Kane attempted to coordinate a counterattack, but the enemy's positioning made any movement costly. "We need air support," he shouted into his radio. But the morning's clear skies had given way to a heavy overcast, complicating any potential close air support mission. PFC Jalil's voice cut through the tactical channel with alarming news. "They're setting up heavy weapons on the northern ridge, Chinese-made HMGs." The presence of such sophisticated equipment confirmed Navarro's fears. This was a well-planned operation by a professional force. The platoon's situation grew more desperate with each passing minute. Their ammunition wouldn't last forever, and the enemy showed no signs of breaking contact. Through his scope, Navarro caught another glimpse of the commanding figure on the ridgeline. The man's bearing and the respect shown by his fighters left little doubt. Mullah Faheem was personally directing this attack. As Doc Teague worked to stabilize another casualty, he voiced what many were thinking. "This isn't random, Chief. They knew exactly where to hit us." The implication hung heavy in the air. Had their mission been compromised? Was there a leak somewhere in their chain of command? The battle reached a critical phase as Taliban fighters began pushing closer, using the rough terrain for cover. Their confidence suggested they knew something the Americans didn't. What cards did Mullah Faheem still hold in reserve? And could the platoon hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive? The acrid smell of cordite hung heavy in the mountain air as Staff Sergeant Chief Navarro shepherded the remaining members of his platoon into the yawning darkness of the cave. Entrance. Blood trickled from a graze wound on his temple, but his focus remained razor-sharp. Behind him, Deshaun Brooks helped Doc Teague carry a wounded soldier, while PFC Jalil provided rear security, his young face etched with determination. Lieutenant Kane stumbled in last, his normally pristine uniform now caked with dust and blood. The cave's darkness swallowed them whole, offering both sanctuary and uncertainty. How long could they hold out here? What dangers lurked in these ancient stone corridors? "Doc, set up triage in that alcove," Navarro ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Brooks, establish a defensive position near the entrance. Jalil, I need you to scout ahead about 50 meters. Look for any secondary exits." Each command was met with silent nods of acknowledgement, the unit moving with practiced precision despite their exhaustion. The tension between Kane and Navarro crackled like static electricity in the confined space. Kane's jaw clenched as he watched Navarro deploy their remaining forces, his own authority seemingly diminished in this crisis. But even he couldn't deny the staff sergeant's tactical acumen. It had been Navarro's quick thinking that had saved them from complete annihilation. In the ambush, Doc Teague worked methodically in the dim light of a chemical glow stick, her hand steady as she assessed the wounded. "Chief," she called softly, "Martinez isn't going to make it without proper medical attention. We need to get him to a facility within the next few hours." The gravity in her voice spoke volumes about their situation. PFC Jalil returned from his reconnaissance, his movement silent despite the loose rocks underfoot. "There's another exit about 40 meters in, Staff Sergeant. It leads to a narrow ravine on the eastern face." His report was interrupted by distant echoes of voices. Mullah Faheem's men were getting closer. The cave complex became their temporary fortress, but it could easily become their tomb. Navarro knew they needed to make crucial decisions quickly. Their ammunition was limited, they had wounded men, and their communications were spotty at best in these stone confines. The weight of command pressed down on him like the mountain itself. Brooks positioned himself near the cave mouth, his rifle trained on the approach. The trust between him and Navarro was evident in every movement, every unspoken command. It was this bond that had kept them alive through countless firefights. But would it be enough this time? Kane paced in the shadows, his authority challenged not just by circumstances, but by his own internal struggles. The prejudices he'd harbored against Jalil seemed trivial now, faced with their collective fight for survival. He watched as the young Afghan-American soldier helped Doc Teague with the wounded, his earlier suspicions giving way to grudging respect. The distant sound of falling rocks caused everyone to freeze. Were Faheem's forces already probing the cave system? Had they found tracks leading to this sanctuary? The darkness beyond their position seemed to pulse with potential threats, each shadow possibly concealing an enemy fighter. Navarro gathered his core team, Kane, Brooks, and Doc Teague, while Jalil maintained watch. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. The cave offered protection, but it could also become a death trap if Faheem's men decided to wait them out. Their supplies wouldn't last forever, and Martinez's condition was deteriorating by the hour. The complexity of their relationships was stripped bare in this crisis. Kane's leadership style clashed with Navarro's experience, yet they needed to find common ground. Brooks's protective instincts toward Doc Teague had to be balanced against tactical necessity, and Jalil's unique skills might be their only hope of navigating both the physical and cultural landscape outside. As they huddled in the dim light, planning their next move, the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed from the valley below. Mullah Faheem was making sure they knew he was still out there, still hunting them. The cave's sanctuary was temporary, but would their fractured unit find the strength to survive what came next? The fate of the wounded Martinez added urgency to their deliberations. Each passing minute reduced his chances of survival, but a hasty exit could doom them all. In the darkness of their stone shelter, time seemed to move differently, both too fast and too slow, as they grappled with decisions that would determine who lived and who died in these ancient mountains. The flickering light from military-issue flashlights cast dancing shadows across the cave walls, as PFC Ahmed Jalil studied the ancient markings with growing concern. His fingers traced the worn etchings, years of military intelligence training, kicking in as patterns began to emerge from what others might dismiss as simple tribal artwork. What secrets lay hidden in these weathered walls? Staff Sergeant Navarro noticed AJ's intense focus and moved closer, careful not to disturb the young soldier's concentration. The rest of the surviving platoon members huddled deeper in the cave system, tending to wounds and trying to catch whatever rest they could after their harrowing escape. The constant drip of underground water provided an ominous backdrop to their temporary sanctuary. "Chief," AJ whispered, his voice tight with tension, "these markings aren't just decorative. They're coded messages. Recent ones." He pointed to specific sequences that seemed to stand out from the older patterns. "See how the patina differs here? These were added within the last few months." Navarro studied the wall more closely while Lieutenant Kane approached from behind, his presence adding an immediate layer of tension to the discovery. The lieutenant's previous prejudices toward AJ had created a rift that even their shared combat experiences hadn't fully bridged. How would he react to intelligence coming from the soldier he'd so often dismissed? Doc Teague joined them silently, her medical kit still slung across her shoulder as she peered at the markings. Her presence seemed to ease some of the tension, as it often did. "What kind of messages are we talking about, AJ?" she asked softly. AJ's fingers continued tracing the patterns as he translated. "They're using an old tribal cipher, but mixed with modern military coordinates." His voice grew harder as the meaning became clear. "These are movement schedules, patrol patterns, supply routes, our patterns. Someone's been feeding Mullah Faheem information about our operations for months." The revelation hung heavy in the damp cave air. Sergeant Brooks moved closer, his earlier distrust of AJ forgotten in the face of this discovery. "Are you saying we've got a mole? Someone's been setting us up this whole time?" The implications were staggering. Every ambush, every near miss, every perfect trap they'd walked into. None of it had been coincidence. The enemy had been reading their playbook, anticipating their moves, and using their own tactics against them. But who could have access to such detailed operational information? AJ continued decoding the messages, his training allowing him to piece together fragments of information. The betrayal went deeper than simple patrol schedules. Weapons shipments, force deployments, even personal details about key personnel were encoded in these seemingly primitive markings. Someone with high-level access was working with the enemy. Dull. Kane's face hardened as the evidence mounted. "How far back do these messages go? Can you tell who's been leaving them?" The question sparked a new tension in the group. Trust, already strained by their circumstances, now threatened to shatter completely. Who among them could they really rely on? The cave suddenly felt smaller, more confining, as suspicion cast its shadow over their refuge. Navarro watched his team carefully, noting how this revelation affected each of them. Doc Teague's normally steady hands fidgeted with her medical supplies. Brooks kept glancing at the cave entrance as if expecting enemies to materialize from the darkness. Even Kane seemed shaken, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of possible betrayal. But it was AJ who carried the heaviest burden. His ability to decode these messages had revealed a truth that could tear their unit apart or save their lives. The question now was how to use this information without destroying the fragile trust that kept them alive in this hostile territory. As the implications of their discovery sank in, new questions emerged. How had their enemy maintained this hidden communication network? Who else knew about these caves and their secrets? And most importantly, how could they identify the traitor in their midst before it was too late? The answers might lie deeper in the cave system, where more messages waited to be decoded. But time was running out. Mullah Faheem's forces would be searching for them. And now they knew it wasn't just chance guiding the enemy's pursuit. Someone was guiding them. Someone who knew exactly where to look. The tension that had been building within the unit finally reached its breaking point during a scorching afternoon in the Hindu Kush. Lieutenant Kane's suspicions about PFC Ahmed Jalil had been simmering since their discovery of the cave markings, and, like a powder keg near an open flame, it was only a matter of time before everything exploded. What started as a routine debriefing quickly descended into something far more volatile. Kane's voice, sharp and accusatory, cut through the makeshift command post as he confronted AJ about the similarities between the cave markings and the young soldier's dialect notes. How could someone with AJ's background not have recognized the patterns sooner? Why hadn't he reported his suspicions about the local communications? Staff Sergeant Navarro watched the confrontation unfold, his weathered features masking the internal struggle between his duty to the chain of command and his instinct to protect his soldier. He'd seen this kind of suspicion before, the way fear could twist perception until every coincidence became evidence of betrayal. Doc Teague stepped forward, her medical kit clutched unnecessarily tight against her chest. "Sir, with all due respect, AJ's been nothing but loyal to this unit." Her words carried the weight of countless shared experiences, of wounds treated and confidences kept. But Kane wasn't finished. The lieutenant produced a series of communications, intercepts, laying them out like playing cards in a game of solitaire. Each piece seemed to suggest a pattern of information leaks that coincided with AJ's watch rotations. Could it be mere coincidence that Mullah Faheem's forces always seemed one step ahead during those times? Sergeant Brooks, who had initially shared Kane's suspicions about AJ, found himself torn. The evidence seemed compelling, yet something about the situation felt wrong. He'd watched AJ risk his life for fellow soldiers, seen him work tirelessly to help the unit navigate local customs and avoid unnecessary conflicts. The accusations hit AJ like physical blows, each one chipping away at the foundation of trust he'd worked so hard to build. "Lieutenant, I've bled for this unit," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "My loyalty isn't determined by my last name or where my parents were born." Navarro finally intervened, positioning himself between Kane and AJ. "We're all Americans here, sir, and right now we're giving Mullah Faheem exactly what he wants, division from within." The tension in the room shifted as other soldiers began taking sides. Some stood closer to Kane, their own fears and prejudices bubbling to the surface. Others moved toward AJ, forming a protective circle that spoke volumes about the bonds forged in combat. Doc Teague's medical training had taught her to look for underlying causes, and she recognized the symptoms of a unit under extreme stress. The constant pursuit by enemy forces, the isolation, the mysterious cave markings. It was all taking its toll on their psychological well-being. Kane's next words carried the weight of command authority. "I'm relieving PFC Jalil of his duties, pending further investigation." The statement hung in the air like a physical presence, drawing invisible lines between members of the unit. Navarro's response was measured but firm. "Sir, removing AJ from his duties doesn't just punish him, it handicaps our entire unit. We lose our best translator, our cultural liaison, and a damn good soldier." The division within the unit created opportunities that their enemies would be quick to exploit. Already the sound of distant gunfire served as a reminder that Mullah Faheem's forces were still out there, watching and waiting. How much of their current predicament stemmed from actual betrayal, and how much was the result of paranoia and fear? As the confrontation reached its peak, a new question emerged. Could the unit survive this internal strife long enough to face the external threats that surrounded them? The answer would depend not just on their ability to fight together, but on their willingness to trust each other when every instinct screamed of danger and betrayal. The sun continued its relentless beat down on the Hindu Kush, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath its harsh glare. In the distance, the mountains stood as silent witnesses to a unit tearing itself apart from within, while their enemies gathered like wolves sensing weakness in their prey. The mountain winds carried whispers of approaching winter as Staff Sergeant Raymond Navarro found PFC Ahmed Jalil sitting alone at the observation post, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. The young soldier's shoulders carried the weight of Lieutenant Kane's accusations, but there was something else troubling him. A darkness Navarro recognized all too well. "You're thinking about Kandahar, aren't you?" Navarro's voice cut through, the silence causing AJ to flinch slightly. The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. How many nights had Navarro himself spent replaying those same memories? The story of Navarro's past emerged slowly, like water seeping through stone. 10 years earlier, in another lifetime, he'd led a different group of men through the narrow streets of Kandahar. His team had included a local interpreter, Farid, whose loyalty and dedication had earned him the trust of every American soldier in the unit. But trust, Navarro had learned, was a double-edged sword. "We never saw the betrayal coming," Navarro continued, his voice carrying the weight of years of self-recrimination. "Farid had been with us for months. He'd eaten with us, fought beside us, saved our lives more than once." The memory of what happened next made his jaw clench. "He led us straight into an ambush. 3 good men died that day." AJ listened intently, his own troubles momentarily forgotten as Navarro's story unfolded. The parallels between Farid and his own situation were impossible to ignore. Both had faced suspicion because of their heritage. Both had struggled to prove their loyalty in a war that blurred the lines between friend and foe. "I carried that guilt for years," Navarro admitted. "Blamed myself for trusting too easily, for not seeing the signs. But you know what I learned, AJ? The real failure wasn't in trusting Farid. It was in letting that betrayal change who I am as a leader." The revelation struck a chord with AJ, who had been grappling with his own identity since Kane's accusations. How could he serve alongside men who questioned his every move, who saw his Afghan heritage as a liability rather than an asset? Navarro shifted his position, his eyes meeting AJ's directly. "You're not Farid, AJ, and I'm not the same sergeant who led that patrol in Kandahar. We can't let the ghosts of our past dictate our future actions." The conversation turned to the present situation, to the growing tensions within the unit. Navarro shared how he'd watched AJ prove himself time and again, how the young soldier's cultural understanding had saved lives during their recent operations. But he also spoke of the fear that drove Kane's suspicions, the fear that every leader carried of making a decision that could cost lives. "The thing about ghosts," Navarro said, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone, "is that they only have the power we give them. Kane's operating from his own fears, his own experiences, but that doesn't make him right." The discussion delved deeper into the complexities of trust in warfare, the delicate balance between caution and paranoia. Navarro revealed how he'd learned to trust his instincts again, to judge each person on their own merits, rather than through the lens of past betrayals. As the conversation drew to a close, Navarro shared one final insight that would resonate with AJ long after their talk ended. "The strongest bonds in combat aren't forged by blind trust or constant suspicion. They're built on understanding, on recognizing that every soldier brings their own ghosts to the battlefield. The question isn't whether we have demons, it's how we choose to face them." The exchange between Navarro and AJ represented more than just a mentor counseling a troubled soldier. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, of recognition that their experiences, though different, carried similar wounds. Through Navarro's story, AJ began to see his own situation in a new light. Could the very heritage that made some question his loyalty become his greatest strength in the challenges that lay ahead? As the mountain shadows lengthened, both men understood that their conversation had shifted something fundamental in their relationship. The ghosts of Kandahar would always be there, but they no longer held the power to define the future. What remained was the choice of how to move forward, how to build trust in a world where certainty was a luxury they couldn't afford. The darkness of the cave system pressed in around Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro as he led his team deeper into the mountain's belly. The rhythmic drip of water and the soft crunch of boots on loose stone created an eerie symphony that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. But Navarro knew the real dangers lurking in these shadowy passages weren't ancient at all. They were very much present and deadly. PFC Ahmed Jalil moved silently beside him, his training as a combat interpreter making him particularly attuned to the subtle sounds that might indicate enemy movement. Behind them, Lieutenant Kane maintained an unusually quiet presence, perhaps finally understanding that his usual by-the-book approach held little value in this underground maze. "Chief?" Deshaun Brooks whispered from his position as rear security, using Navarro's nickname with a tension that spoke volumes. "Movement at our 6, maybe 300 meters back." Navarro raised his fist, bringing the unit to an immediate halt. Doc Teague instinctively moved closer to the center of the formation, knowing that if things went sideways, his medical skills would be crucial in these confined spaces. The team held their breath, straining to hear what Brooks had detected. The soft echo of displaced rocks confirmed Brooks' warning. Taliban forces had indeed entered the cave system, likely led by Mullah Faheem himself. The militant leader had proven himself a cunning adversary, one who understood that sometimes the best way to hunt was to follow your prey into their own den. "AJ," Navarro whispered, "any other exits marked on those local maps you studied?" Jalil's face was barely visible in the dim light of their tactical lamps, but his expression carried clear concern. "Two possible routes, Chief, but the locals spoke of cave-ins. What's stable on their charts might not be passable now." Lieutenant Kane moved closer, his previous skepticism of Jalil's intelligence notably absent. The shared danger had a way of stripping away prejudices, leaving only the raw truth of survival. "We need to make a decision, Staff Sergeant. They'll have more men and they know these caves." The irony wasn't lost on Navarro. Here they were, American forces, once again finding themselves in the bowels of Afghanistan's mountains. History had a cruel way of repeating itself, from the British colonial forces to the Soviets, and now them. How many soldiers had made their last stand in these very caves? Doc Teague's voice cut through the tension. "Whatever we decide, we need to move. The air's getting thinner the deeper we go, and I'm not keen on treating anyone for hypoxia down. Here." Navarro weighed their options, knowing each choice carried potentially fatal consequences. Split the team. Risk being picked off in smaller groups. Stand and fight. The enemy's superior numbers would eventually overwhelm them. Continue deeper. They might find themselves trapped with no way out. The sound of voices echoing through the passages made the decision for them. Taliban fighters were communicating, their Pashto carrying clearly through the stone corridors. Jalil's face tightened as he translated in hushed tones. "They're coordinating, planning to seal off sections of the cave. They want to trap us, force us to either surrender or—" The unspoken alternative hung heavy in the air. Navarro had seen enough combat to know that surrender wasn't an option, not with Mullah Faheem's forces. The militant leader's reputation for brutality, especially toward those he considered traitors to Afghanistan, meant Jalil would face a fate worse than death. Brooks shifted his weapon, the movement barely audible but conveying his readiness for whatever came next. The bond between him and Navarro, forged through countless missions, meant no words were necessary. They'd face whatever came as they always had, together. The decision crystallized in Navarro's mind. They couldn't go back, couldn't stay where they were, and couldn't afford to split up. That left only one option: forward into the unknown depths, hoping to find a way through the mountain before their pursuers could seal them in. "We push deeper," Navarro whispered, his voice carrying the weight of command. "AJ, you're on point with me. Kane, watch our flanks. Brooks, you and Doc maintain rear security. Keep it tight, keep it quiet, and remember, sound carries differently down here. Every move needs to be deliberate." As they began their careful advance deeper into the cave system, the echoes of their pursuers grew more distinct. The underground war had begun, and in these ancient passages, modern technology and tactical advantages meant little. Here, In the dark heart of Afghanistan's mountains, it would come down to instinct, experience, and the bonds between soldiers. What none of them knew was that the real test of those bonds was yet to come, as Mullah Faheem had more than just fighters at his disposal. The militant leader understood something crucial about cave warfare. Sometimes the mountain itself becomes your most dangerous enemy. The acrid smell hit Staff Sergeant Navarro first, a bitter chemical tang that made his throat constrict. Years of combat experience triggered an immediate response. "Gas masks on now!" His voice echoed through the narrow cave passage as his team scrambled to don their protective gear. Doc Teague moved with practiced efficiency, helping PFC Jalil secure his mask while keeping one eye on the swirling tendrils of yellowish vapor seeping through the cave's crevices. The young medic's training kicked in as she assessed the situation. "Chief, this isn't standard CS gas. The color's wrong, and the dispersal pattern is different." Lieutenant Kane pressed himself against the cave wall, his breathing already labored through his mask's filters. Mullah Faheem's forces must have access to military-grade chemical weapons. "Brooks, what's our status on the rear approach?" Sergeant Brooks emerged from the darkness behind them, his voice muffled by his protective gear. "2 more enemy squads moving in from the south tunnel, sir. They're wearing Soviet-era protection equipment. They knew this was coming." The realization hit Navarro hard. They were being herded. The gas wasn't meant to kill them outright, but to force them deeper into the cave system where Faheem's forces held the advantage. How many more toxic surprises waited in the darkness ahead? PFC Jalil studied the gas patterns with growing concern. The flow indicates they're pumping it through the old ventilation shafts. These caves were used to store munitions during the Soviet occupation. The infrastructure is still intact. The team's options narrowed with each passing minute. The gas would eventually penetrate their filters, and their oxygen supply was limited. Navarro exchanged glances with Doc Teague, both understanding the gravity of their situation. They needed to move, but every direction potentially led to a trap. Kane's leadership training warred with his instincts. "We could try breaking through their line to the surface, but they'll be expecting that. They know these caves better than we do." The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the passages, distorted by the cave's acoustic properties. Were other units encountering similar challenges? The thought of multiple teams being systematically trapped underground sent a chill through Navarro's spine. Brooks checked his weapon's seals, ensuring the gas wouldn't affect its operation. "Chief, remember those mining maps we studied? There was an old emergency shaft about 200 meters east. It might bypass their containment zone." The suggestion sparked a memory in Doc Teague's mind. The shaft would have needed ventilation. If it's still intact, it could provide clean air and a potential escape route. But PFC Jalil's expression behind his mask revealed another concern. Those shafts were deliberately collapsed during the Taliban's rise to power. We'd be gambling on finding one that's still partially open. The gas continued to thicken around them, creating an otherworldly atmosphere in their helmet-mounted lights. The beam caught floating particles, creating halos that distorted depth perception and made navigation increasingly treacherous. Navarro weighed their diminishing options. The enemy's strategy was methodical: use the gas to force them into predictable escape routes where ambush teams waited. But what if they could turn that assumption against them? The team's training had covered chemical warfare, but the reality of being trapped underground with toxic gas presented challenges no manual could fully address. How would the gas affect their equipment? How long before their filters became compromised? These questions demanded immediate answers. Doc Teague monitored the team's vital signs through their tactical displays, noting elevated heart rates and stress indicators. The psychological impact of chemical weapons, even with protection, couldn't be underestimated. The human mind rebels against invisible threats it cannot fight directly. Lieutenant Kane's earlier prejudices toward PFC Jalil seemed to evaporate in the face of their shared predicament. Survival had a way of stripping away superficial barriers. "AJ, what would Faheem's forces expect us to do in this situation? What's their tactical doctrine?" The question revealed a potential advantage. Their adversary's cultural and military background might make their responses predictable. But could they exploit that predictability without falling into an even more elaborate trap? The gas continued, its inexorable advance through the cave system, a silent enemy that couldn't be shot or outmaneuvered in conventional ways. Time pressed against them like a physical force, demanding decisions that could mean the difference between survival and a fate worse than a quick death in combat. The acrid stench of chemical agents still lingered in the air as Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro led his team through the winding cave system. Doc Teague moved methodically among the soldiers, checking each man's condition after their exposure to the mysterious gas. Her practiced hands moved swiftly, but Navarro noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, a detail that spoke volumes about the gravity of their situation. Lieutenant Kane's earlier decision to push deeper into the cave network had met with silent resistance from the team, but none could deny the strategic necessity. PFC Jalil, their cultural liaison and interpreter, had intercepted communications suggesting Mullah Faheem's forces were preparing for something bigger than their usual hit-and-run tactics. What could be worse than chemical weapons in an enclosed space? The answer came with devastating swiftness. The first indication was a metallic click that echoed through the darkness, a sound that every soldier dreaded. Deshaun Brooks, who had been point man, froze mid-step. The beam of his tactical light illuminated the crude pressure plate beneath his boot. Their EOD specialist had been separated during the gas attack, leaving them with limited options. Doc Teague's voice cut through the tension. "Don't move, Brooks." She approached slowly, her medical pack still slung across her shoulder. The rest of the team maintained security, their weapons trained on the surrounding darkness. Lieutenant Kane, for once, remained silent, understanding that this situation required expertise rather than authority. Jalil's whispered warning came too late. "Movement 3 o'clock." The distinctive sound of AK-47s being charged echoed through the cave. Mullah Faheem's men had been waiting, using the IED to trap them in a kill zone. The first burst of gunfire sparked a chaotic exchange, forcing the team to seek what little cover the cave walls provided. In the midst of the firefight, Doc Teague made a decision that would alter the unit forever. She had spotted a way to disarm the pressure plate, but it would leave her exposed to enemy fire. The choice between saving Brooks and maintaining her own safety wasn't really a choice at all for someone who had sworn to preserve life. Navarro recognized her intent before she moved. "Doc, don't..." But she was already in motion, her medical pack discarded as she dropped beside Brooks. Her hands moved with practiced precision, even as rounds impacted the rock around her. The pressure plate's crude construction meant it could be disarmed quickly by someone with steady hands and technical knowledge, both of which Teague possessed. The moment Brooks cleared the deadly device, multiple things happened simultaneously. Teague shouted, "Clear!" as she shoved Brooks toward cover. Mullah Faheem's voice echoed through the cave, ordering his men to concentrate fire. And Lieutenant Kane, witnessing true leadership in action, broke cover to provide suppressing fire. The impact of multiple rounds striking Teague's body seemed to happen in slow motion. She was thrown backward, her body illuminated by muzzle flashes like a macabre dance. Jalil was the first to reach her, his medical training supplementing hers, but the look in his eyes told the story before words could. The team's response was immediate and devastating. Navarro coordinated with Kane, their previous tensions forgotten, in the face of a common purpose. The lieutenant's tactical knowledge combined with the staff sergeant's experience created a lethal response. Deshaun Brooks, driven by a combination of guilt and rage, demonstrated why he was considered one of the unit's best marksmen. What followed was a display of military precision that would have made their trainers proud. The team systematically eliminated the threat, their movements synchronized by grief and determination. Mullah Faheem's forces, expecting to find a broken unit, instead encountered a cohesive fighting force, united by sacrifice. As the echo of the last gunshot faded, the team gathered around their fallen healer. Doc Teague's sacrifice had done more than save Brooks. It had shattered the barriers between team members, forcing them to confront their prejudices and differences. Lieutenant Kane knelt beside Jalil, helping to treat Teague's wounds. No longer seeing an Afghan American, but a fellow soldier. The question hanging in the air was not if they would get Teague out, but how quickly they could reach proper medical facilities. The cave system had become more than a battlefield. It was now a race against time. Would the bonds forged in this dark place be strong enough to overcome the challenges ahead? And how would Mullah Faheem respond to this defeat? The echoes of gunfire still rang in Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro's ears as he led his battered unit through the dimly lit tunnel system. Doc Teague's sacrifice weighed heavily on everyone's minds, but there was no time for grief. Not yet. The underground river system beneath the mountain complex offered their only chance of escape from Mullah Faheem's pursuing forces. "Chief, the water's rising," PFC Jalil whispered, his voice tight with concern. The young soldier's usually steady. Hands trembled as he helped support Brooks, who was still struggling with his injuries from the earlier firefight. Navarro assessed their situation with practiced efficiency. The tunnel's ancient stonework glistened with moisture, and the water level had indeed crept up several inches in the past hour. Lieutenant Kane stood a few feet away, his face a mask of contained fury and guilt. Doc's blood still stained his uniform from their failed attempt to save him. "We keep moving," Navarro responded, his voice carrying the weight of command. The intelligence suggested these tunnels connect to the valley's drainage system. If we follow the current, it should lead us to an exit point beyond their search. Perimeter. The sound of distant explosions filtered through the rock above them. Mullah Faheem's forces were getting desperate, using increasingly aggressive tactics to flush them out. Each blast sent cascades of dust and small debris raining down from the ceiling, a reminder that their underground sanctuary could become a tomb with one well-placed charge. Brooks shifted uncomfortably, his face pale in the beam of their tactical lights. "Chief, about Doc," he started, but Navarro cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Later, Brooks. Right now, we focus on surviving. That's what Doc would expect from us." The words tasted bitter in Navarro's mouth, but they were necessary. He could see the same pain reflected in each soldier's eyes. The loss of their medic had cut deep into the unit's soul. Lieutenant Kane moved closer, his voice low and urgent. "The water's not just rising, it's moving faster. Could mean we're approaching a larger channel, or they've opened the upstream controls," Jalil finished, his experience with local infrastructure proving valuable once again. The old Soviet systems, they could be using them to flood us out. The realization spurred them into action. Navarro took point, with Kane bringing up the rear. The tunnel curved gradually downward, following the water's natural flow. The current pulled at their legs, making each step a calculated risk. Their equipment, already soaked, grew heavier with every passing minute. The sound of rushing water grew louder, drowning out their labored breathing. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber where multiple channels converged. The water here moved with frightening speed, white foam visible in their light beams. But it was what lay beyond that caught Navarro's attention, a faint glimmer of natural light barely visible through the spray. "There's our exit," Navarro announced, studying the chamber's layout. "But that current's going to be a problem. One wrong move, and it'll sweep you right into those rock formations." Kane moved forward, his earlier antagonism temporarily forgotten, in the face of their shared predicament. "We could try to rig a guideline. The demo cord in Brooks' pack might be long enough." Before they could implement the plan, a new sound cut through the chamber, the distinctive crack of small arms fire, followed by the impact of bullets on stone. Their pursuers had caught up. "Contact rear," Kane shouted, dropping into a defensive position. Jalil and Brooks took what cover they could find behind stone pillars, returning fire with controlled bursts. Navarro's mind raced through their options, each one worse than the last. The chamber offered little protection, and their ammunition was running critically low. The rushing water promised either escape or death with little middle ground. The decision was made for them when a grenade bounced into view, its metallic clinking barely audible above the water's roar. "Water! Now!" Navarro commanded, grabbing Brooks's vest and pulling him toward the channel. The explosion sent shockwaves through the chamber as they plunged into the current. The freezing water hit like a physical blow, driving the air from their lungs. The powerful flow grabbed them instantly, throwing them into its chaotic embrace. Navarro fought to keep his head above water, catching glimpses of his team being swept along with him. The chamber's exit approached with frightening speed, the natural light growing brighter. But would they survive what waited beyond? And how many of Mullah Faheem's forces would be waiting when they emerged? The questions remained unanswered as the current pulled them through the opening, hurling them toward whatever fate awaited on the other side. In that moment, as the mountain's grip finally released them, Navarro could almost hear Doc's voice over the rush of water. "Keep them alive, Chief, just keep them alive." The echoes of rushing water still rang in their ears as Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro led his exhausted unit away from the underground river system. The cold mountain water had nearly claimed them all, but through sheer determination and Navarro's expert guidance, they had emerged alive. Yet the victory felt hollow as Lieutenant Marcus Kane struggled with the weight of his near-fatal decision that had almost cost them everything. Who could have predicted that Kane's stubborn insistence on taking the lower tunnel would lead to such a harrowing ordeal? The question haunted him as he watched his men recover, particularly PFC Ahmed Jalil, who was still shivering despite Doc Teague's best efforts to warm him. Kane's prejudices against Jalil's Afghan heritage had clouded his judgment, making him dismiss the young soldier's warnings about the seasonal flooding patterns. Sergeant Deshaun Brooks shot Kane a reproachful look while helping Doc distribute dry clothing from their waterproof packs. The tension between them was palpable, but something had shifted during their underwater escape. When Kane had become trapped beneath a fallen beam, it was Navarro who had fought against the current to free him, risking his own life in the process. The revelation of Navarro's actions weighed heavily on Kane's conscience. How many times had he dismissed the staff sergeant's expertise, viewing his popularity with the men as a threat to his own authority? The memory of Navarro's iron grip pulling him to safety forced Kane to confront his own shortcomings as a leader. Doc Teague noticed the lieutenant's internal struggle as she checked him for signs of hypothermia. "Sometimes the strongest leaders are those who can admit when they're wrong," she said quietly, her words carrying more weight than any medical treatment she could provide. Kane nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her statement. The unit's brief rest was interrupted by distant explosions. Mullah Faheem's forces were closing in. Kane watched as Navarro immediately began coordinating their defense, his natural leadership drawing the men together despite their exhaustion. This time, instead of attempting to override Navarro's decisions, Kane found himself studying the staff sergeant's methods. What happened next would forever change the dynamic between the two leaders. As Navarro outlined their defensive strategy, Kane stepped forward and publicly acknowledged his error in judgment at the tunnels. The admission stunned the unit into silence, but none more so than PFC Jalil, who had never expected such recognition from the lieutenant. The gesture sparked a transformation in Kane. He began actively seeking Navarro's counsel, combining the staff sergeant's practical experience with his own tactical training. Their complementary skills proved crucial as they worked together to fortify their position against Faheem's approaching forces. Deshaun Brooks witnessed this evolution with cautious optimism. Having served under both men, he recognized the potential strength in their unified leadership. The question remained, would this newfound respect survive the brutal challenges that lay ahead? The answer came sooner than expected when their position came under heavy fire. Kane and Navarro moved in perfect synchronization, directing the unit's response with the effectiveness that surprised even their enemies. Doc Teague found herself treating fewer casualties than usual, a testament to their improved command decisions. As night fell, the unit gathered for a brief strategy session. The atmosphere had changed. Gone was the underlying current of resentment and distrust. In its place was a growing sense of unity, built on the foundation of Kane's redemption and Navarro's unwavering leadership. PFC Jalil, who had remained quiet throughout the day's events, finally spoke up during the meeting. His intelligence about local tribal movements, previously dismissed by Kane, now received proper attention. The lieutenant's willingness to listen marked the final transformation in their professional relationship. The next morning brought new challenges as Mullah Faheem's forces probed their defenses. But this time, the unit responded as one cohesive force, their actions guided by the combined wisdom of both leaders. Kane's tactical expertise, tempered by Navarro's practical experience, created a defensive strategy that kept them one step ahead of their pursuers. What began as a near disaster in the flooded tunnels had evolved into a turning point for the entire unit. Kane's redemption wasn't just about admitting his mistakes. It was about embracing a new way of leadership that valued experience over rank and wisdom over authority. As they prepared for their next move, the question wasn't whether Kane had changed, but how this change would affect their chances of survival in the battles to come. The pre-dawn air hung thick with tension as Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro led his unit from the mountain cave system. After saving Lieutenant Kane from certain death hours earlier, the dynamic between the two leaders had shifted palpably. The mutual antagonism that had defined their relationship since the mission's start had given way to something resembling respect, though neither man would openly acknowledge it. PFC Ahmed Jalil moved cautiously at point position, his trained eyes scanning the rocky terrain ahead. Behind him, Corporal Doc Teague maintained a watchful presence over Sergeant Deshaun Brooks, who was still nursing wounds from their earlier firefight. The group's exhaustion was evident in their measured movements, each step calculated against the possibility of hidden threats. What awaited them at the cave's mouth, however, was far worse than any of them had anticipated. Mullah Faheem stood confidently among a contingent of his fighters, their weapons trained on the emerging Americans. The Taliban commander's weather-worn face bore a satisfied smile that sent chills through the unit. How had he known exactly where to find them? The answer came in a series of rapid-fire Pashto words from one of Faheem's men, words that caused PFC Jalil to stiffen noticeably. The revelation hit Navarro like a physical blow. Someone had betrayed their position. But who? The question hung in the air as heavily as the morning mist, each team member casting furtive glances at their companions. Lieutenant Kane's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, but Navarro's subtle headshake stopped him. They were outnumbered 3-1, with fighters positioned on both the high ground and in the valley below. Any aggressive move would result in immediate casualties. Doc Teague's medical training kicked in as she assessed their situation, noting the various injuries within their unit that would impact their chances in a firefight. Her eyes met Navarro's, conveying without words the grim reality of their predicament. They needed a solution that didn't involve direct confrontation. Sergeant Brooks, despite his injuries, maintained his protective stance near Doc Teague, his years of combat experience telling him that their options were severely limited. The trust he'd built with Navarro over countless missions now faced its ultimate test. Would his mentor have a plan to get them out of this impossible situation? Mullah Faheem's voice carried across the distance, his English deliberate and accented. Your journey ends here, Americans, but perhaps we can negotiate terms that benefit us all. His words carried an undercurrent of malice that belied their diplomatic surface. The tension within the unit reached a breaking point as PFC Jalil stepped forward, his movement drawing immediate attention from both sides. His cultural understanding of the situation might offer insights the others lacked, but his actions also raised questions about loyalty that had simmered beneath the surface throughout their mission. Lieutenant Kane's previous prejudices toward Jalil threatened to resurface, but his recent experiences had taught him valuable lessons about judgment and trust. The way forward would require setting aside personal biases and working together, regardless of their differences. Navarro's mind raced through possible scenarios, each one more desperate than the last. Their ammunition was low, their supplies depleted, and their strength diminished from days of constant movement and combat. Yet surrender wasn't an option, not with what they knew about Faheem's operations and the intelligence they carried. The morning sun began to crest the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the standoff. Time was not on their side. Each passing moment gave Faheem's reinforcements more opportunity to arrive and further deteriorate their already precarious position. The question wasn't just how they would escape, but whether they could maintain unit cohesion under such extreme pressure. Doc Teague's medical supplies were running low, and Brooks's condition would only worsen without proper treatment. The human cost of their situation added another layer of urgency to their predicament. How long could they maintain their position before physical limitations forced their hand? As Navarro surveyed their surroundings, seeking any advantage they might exploit, he realized that their greatest strength lay not in their weapons or tactical position, but in the bonds they'd forged through adversity. The very conflicts and prejudices that had threatened to tear them apart might now prove to be their salvation. If they could trust each other completely in the face of overwhelming odds. The harsh Afghan sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro studied the impossible situation before him. Mullah Faheem's forces had them surrounded, their superior numbers creating an ever-tightening noose around the small American unit. How many good men and women would be lost if they attempted a direct confrontation? Through his scope, Navarro observed the enemy positions while his mind raced through potential scenarios. Each calculation led to the same devastating conclusion: a head-on engagement would result in catastrophic casualties. Behind him, he could sense the nervous energy emanating from his team. Deshaun Brooks stood closest, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a tense alertness that spoke volumes about their predicament. Lieutenant Kane approached Navarro's position, crawling low to avoid detection. The previous friction between them had evaporated in the face of their shared crisis. "What's your assessment, Chief?" Kane whispered, using Navarro's nickname for the first time without a trace of his usual condescension. The gesture wasn't lost on Navarro, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. Doc Teague's voice crackled through their comms, reporting on the condition of their wounded. They had 3 men who couldn't move under their own power, making any rapid evacuation nearly impossible. PFC Jalil was monitoring the enemy's communications, his understanding of the local dialect providing crucial intelligence about Faheem's positioning. As Navarro processed these details, a plan began forming, one that made his stomach turn but offered the highest probability of survival for his unit. He'd need to create a diversion significant enough to draw Faheem's attention, allowing the main group to retreat to safety. The math was simple: one life risked to save many. But who would volunteer for what could amount to a suicide mission? Brooks seemed to read Navarro's thoughts. "Whatever you're thinking, Chief, I'm with you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The loyalty in his words made Navarro's decision even harder. How could he ask any of these men to sacrifice themselves? PFC Jalil interrupted their discussion with urgent news. "They're mobilizing, Sergeant. Faheem's men are preparing to attack from multiple positions." The young soldier's voice carried the weight of certainty. Their time for planning was running out. Lieutenant Kane studied Navarro's face, years of military experience allowing him to recognize the look of a man contemplating final options. "We need solutions, Staff Sergeant. What's your call?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Navarro's mind drifted to his training days, to the countless discussions about leadership and sacrifice. Every commander eventually faces a moment where theory meets reality, where textbook scenarios transform into life and death decisions. Was this his moment? What would his choice reveal about his character, his commitment to his unit? Doc Teague's voice cut through his thoughts again, this time in person as she crawled to their position. "Whatever we do, we need to do it soon. These wounded won't last long without proper medical attention." Her clinical assessment carried an undertone of urgency that couldn't be ignored. The pieces of Navarro's plan solidified as he watched Faheem's men moving into position. The terrain offered one possible advantage: a narrow ravine that could funnel enemy forces into a predictable path. If someone could hold that position long enough, the rest of the unit could slip away through the hidden mountain paths that PFC Jalil had identified earlier. But the question remained, who would stay behind? The responsibility of command weighed heavily on Navarro's shoulders as he considered his options. Each member of his unit had unique skills vital to the group's survival. Brooks's combat expertise, Jalil's language skills, Doc's medical knowledge. They were all essential for the challenging escape ahead. Lieutenant Kane watched Navarro intently, perhaps recognizing the burden of the decision before them. Their earlier conflicts seemed trivial now, washed away by the immediate threat to their survival. Would Kane support Navarro's plan once it was revealed? Would he understand the necessity of the sacrifice it required? The sound of distant gunfire punctuated the gravity of their situation. Time was running out. Navarro knew he had to act, had to make the call that would determine the fate of his unit. But as he prepared to share his plan, he couldn't help wondering, would this decision haunt him for the rest of his life, or would it be his final act of leadership? The mountain winds carried the acrid scent of cordite and blood through the narrow valleys of the Hindu Kush. Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro moved with practiced precision through the rocky terrain, his weathered hands gripping his rifle with the familiarity of an old friend. Behind him, the sounds of sporadic gunfire echoed. His diversion was working, drawing Mullah Faheem's forces away from the rest of the platoon. Who would emerge victorious in this deadly game of cat and mouse? The question hung heavy in the thin, mountain air as Navarro considered his adversary. Mullah Faheem was no ordinary opponent. The insurgent leader had proven himself a master strategist, always one step ahead, always pushing the psychological boundaries of warfare. But Navarro had something Faheem didn't: decades of experience and the weight of his men's lives driving him forward. PFC, Ahmed Jalil's intelligence had been crucial in understanding Faheem's tactics. The young soldier's cultural insights had revealed how the mullah thought, how he moved, and most importantly, how he would react to Navarro's gambit. The irony wasn't lost on Navarro. The same soldier Lieutenant Kane had initially distrusted had provided the key to their survival. The sound of loose rocks tumbling down the slope caught Navarro's attention. He froze, becoming one with the shadows cast by the towering peaks. Voices carried on the wind. Faheem's men were closing in. The insurgents spoke in rapid Pashto, their words carrying traces of frustration and urgency. Through the gaps in the rocks, Navarro caught glimpses of their movements, noting how they spread out in a familiar search pattern. Doc Teague's words from their last conversation resonated in Navarro's mind. The medic had seen right through his plan, understanding the likely outcome of this final confrontation. "Sometimes the best medicine is prevention," Doc had said, his eyes conveying what his words couldn't. But prevention wasn't an option anymore, not with Faheem's forces bearing down on their position. Sergeant Deshaun Brooks had wanted to join this hunt, his loyalty to Navarro unwavering until the end. But Navarro knew Brooks was needed elsewhere, leading the remainder of the platoon to safety. The young sergeant had grown beyond being just a soldier under his command. He had become the leader Navarro had always seen in him. The game of shadows continued as Navarro maneuvered through the terrain, drawing Faheem's men deeper into his carefully laid trap. Each step was calculated, each position chosen with purpose. The mountain itself became a weapon in Navarro's arsenal, its treacherous slopes and hidden crevices offering both protection and opportunity. Lieutenant Kane's voice crackled over the radio, breaking the tense silence. The message was brief. The platoon had reached the extraction point. Despite their differences, Kane had come to respect Navarro's judgment, finally understanding that leadership wasn't about rank, but about experience and sacrifice. The sun began, its descent behind the peaks casting long shadows that transformed the mountainside into a maze of darkness and light. Navarro knew Faheem would make his move soon. The mullah was too clever to let the advantage of daylight slip away. The question wasn't if, but when and where the final confrontation would occur. Movement caught Navarro's eye, a flash of fabric, the glint of a weapon. Faheem had emerged from his hiding place flanked by his most trusted fighters. The mullah's face showed no fear, only the calm determination of a man who had dedicated his life to warfare. Their eyes met across the rocky expanse, two warriors acknowledging each other's skill and resolve. The mountain air grew still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The distance between hunter and hunted dissolved, replaced by the intimate space of two adversaries who had circled each other for too long. Who was the hunter and who was the hunted? The lines had blurred in this deadly dance, each man both predator and prey. Navarro's finger rested lightly on the trigger, his breathing steady and controlled. The weight of his mission, his men's lives, and the countless decisions that had led to this moment pressed against him like a physical force, but his mind was clear, focused on the single task before him. The time for planning and strategy had passed. Now only action remained. The last rays of sunlight painted the mountains in shades of blood and gold, setting the stage for the final act of this long-running conflict. The question that had driven them all, who would survive this last hunt, was about to be answered in the language of bullets and courage. The relentless pursuit through the mountains had taken its toll on Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro. His weathered hands gripped his rifle tighter as he tracked Mullah Faheem's movement through the rocky terrain. Behind him, Deshaun Brooks maintained vigilant watch, his loyalty to his mentor unwavering even in these desperate hours. The psychological weight of the chase had affected everyone differently. Lieutenant Kane, despite his initial prejudices, had come to respect Navarro's intuitive understanding of their adversary. The lieutenant now deferred to the staff sergeant's expertise, a silent acknowledgement that spoke volumes about their evolved relationship. Doc Teague worked methodically to treat the wounded while they moved, her practiced hands steady despite the tension. She caught Navarro's eye occasionally, communicating volumes through their years of battlefield synchronicity. The unspoken question lingered. Would this be their final mission together? PFC Jalil's cultural insights had proven invaluable throughout their pursuit of Faheem. His understanding of the local dialects and customs had helped them anticipate their enemies' movements, though the weight of being caught between two worlds showed in his tired eyes. Kane's initial suspicion of Jalil had transformed into grudging respect, another testament to how their shared ordeal had reshaped old prejudices. The mountain winds carried whispers of movement ahead. Navarro signaled the team to hold position as he assessed their surroundings. Faheem's psychological warfare had been calculated, designed to fragment their unit, but it had instead forged stronger bonds. Even Brooks, who had initially regarded Jalil with distrust, now worked seamlessly alongside him. Faheem's voice suddenly echoed across the rocks, taunting them in a mixture of Pashto and English. Jalil translated the subtleties that would have been lost on the others, revealing the hidden threats and challenges in the warlord's words. The team watched as Navarro's expression hardened. He understood this would be their final confrontation. The rising sun cast long shadows across the mountainside as Navarro formulated his strategy. He knew Faheem's forces were scattered, their leader increasingly isolated as the American team had systematically dismantled his network. But like a wounded animal, this made him more dangerous, more unpredictable. Kane approached Navarro, their previous tensions dissolved by the gravity of their situation. They spoke in low voices, planning their final approach. Doc Teague joined them, providing crucial information about their team's physical condition and capabilities. Their planning was interrupted by distant gunfire, Faheem's forces making their presence known. Brooks positioned himself to provide covering fire, his movements reflecting years of training under Navarro's guidance. The staff sergeant had shaped him from a raw recruit into a skilled warrior, and now that investment would be tested in the coming battle. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath as Navarro began his advance. Years of combat experience guided his movements as he maneuvered through the terrain. Behind him, his team moved with practiced precision, their trust in his leadership absolute. Even Kane, who had once questioned Navarro's methods, now followed without hesitation. Jalil's voice crackled over the radio, translating intercepted communications between Faheem's remaining fighters. The warlord was cornered, but his desperation made him more dangerous than ever. Would this final confrontation bring the closure they sought, or would it add more names to the long list of sacrifices made in these mountains? The answer lay ahead, where Mullah Faheem waited, equally determined to end this long-running conflict on his terms. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just their military skills, but the bonds that had been forged in the crucible of combat. How would their complex web of relationships influence the outcome of this final, deadly encounter? 10. Years after that fateful day in Afghanistan, PFC Ahmed Jalil, now Major Jalil, stood before a gathering of fresh-faced recruits at Fort Benning. His fingers traced the worn edges of Chief Navarro's combat patch, which he'd kept as a reminder of the man who had changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone in their unit. How could one explain the profound impact of a leader like Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro to these young soldiers? The way he'd transformed a fractured platoon into a cohesive unit, despite Lieutenant Kane's initial resistance and the underlying tensions that had threatened to tear them apart. AJ remembered how Chief had seen past his Afghan heritage when others, particularly Kane, had viewed it with suspicion. The memories flooded back. Doc Teague's quiet strength as she'd patched them up after engagements, her unwavering support, when cultural misunderstandings had threatened to isolate him. Deshaun Brooks's transformation from a suspicious teammate to one of his closest friends. All because Chief had shown them that trust transcended background. What these recruits couldn't understand was how Navarro had mastered the delicate balance between military discipline and human compassion. He'd recognized AJ's potential as a cultural liaison, turning what Lieutenant Kane had seen as a liability into their greatest asset during operations. Those skills had ultimately proved crucial in their final confrontation with Mullah Faheem's forces. Doc Teague had once told AJ, during a quiet moment after treating his combat wounds, that Chief Navarro possessed a rare gift, the ability to see the best in people even when they couldn't see it themselves. This insight had proved prophetic when Navarro had trusted AJ with critical intelligence about local tribal dynamics, information that had saved countless lives. The relationship between Chief and Lieutenant Kane had been particularly complex. AJ recalled the palpable tension during mission briefings, two different leadership styles clashing like thunder in the Afghan mountains. Yet Navarro had never undermined Kane's authority, showing by example how to navigate the delicate hierarchy of command while standing firm in one's principles. Deshaun Brooks had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation under Chief's guidance. From a brash, confrontational soldier to a thoughtful leader in his own right, Brooks had internalized Navarro's lessons about unity and trust. His initial hostility toward AJ had dissolved into a brotherhood forged in combat, proving that prejudices could be overcome through shared experience and understanding. The final battle with Mullah Faheem's forces had crystallized everything Chief Navarro had taught them. When communication broke down and the unit faced overwhelming odds, it was the trust and cohesion he'd built that saw them through. Even Lieutenant Kane had finally recognized the wisdom in Navarro's approach, though. The acknowledgement came at a terrible cost. What would Chief say to these recruits if he were here today? Would he tell them about the night he'd found AJ practicing his prayers and instead of walking away, had sat down to learn about Islamic traditions? Or about the time he'd mediated a heated argument between Brooks and Kane, turning it into a lesson about perspective and respect? Major Jalil's hand tightened around the combat patch as he faced the recruits. How could he convey that true leadership wasn't about rank or authority, but about the ability to bring out the best in others? Chief Navarro had never sought recognition or praise. His legacy lived on in the lives he'd touched and the lessons he'd imparted. Doc Teague, now running a veterans medical clinic, still spoke of how Chief had created an environment where she could practice medicine without the usual military bureaucracy getting in the way. Her ability to treat not just physical wounds but the psychological trauma of combat had flourished under his protection. The echoes of Chief Navarro's influence continued to ripple through the military community. Brooks, now a senior NCO himself, had adopted many of Chief's leadership techniques. Even Kane, after years of reflection, had incorporated elements of Navarro's approach into his command style, acknowledging that effective leadership required both strength and empathy. What made a great leader? Was it the ability to make tough decisions under fire, or the wisdom to know when to listen rather than speak? Chief Navarro had embodied both, and in doing so, had left an indelible mark on everyone who'd served with him. His legacy wasn't just about military success. It was about the transformative power of genuine leadership and the enduring bonds it could create. 10 years after the fateful mission in Afghanistan, PFC Ahmed Jalil stood before a gathering at Arlington National Cemetery, his fingers tracing the cool marble of Staff Sergeant Ray Navarro's headstone. The autumn breeze carried whispers of memories, each one a testament to the man who had changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone in their unit. Who could have predicted that the quiet, stern-faced staff sergeant would become the cornerstone of their survival? The question lingered in AJ's mind as he watched Deshaun Brooks approach, now a master sergeant himself, carrying the weight of responsibility just as Navarro had taught him. Behind him, Doc Teague's medical bag was replaced by a civilian doctor's coat, but her eyes still held the same compassionate determination that had kept them alive during those harrowing days. Lieutenant Kane's absence spoke volumes. His resignation from the military following the mission had surprised no one. The burden of command decisions and the ghost of his prejudices had eventually proven too heavy to bear. Yet even Kane had sent a letter, acknowledging how Navarro's leadership had exposed the flaws in his own command style and changed his perspective forever. The annual gathering had become their tradition, a way to keep Navarro's memory alive and honor the bonds forged in combat. Deshaun often spoke of how Navarro's mentorship had shaped his own leadership style, teaching him that true strength lay not in authority, but in understanding. The lessons learned under Navarro's guidance had rippled through their lives, influencing countless others in ways they never expected. Doc Teague's medical practice now specialized in treating veterans, her experiences with Navarro teaching her that healing went beyond physical wounds. She understood how the echo of combat lingered in the soul, and how the right words, much like Navarro's, could bridge the gap between survival and living. AJ's role as a cultural liaison for military operations stood as perhaps the most direct extension of Navarro's legacy. How many times had he found himself channeling the chief's patience and wisdom when bridging cultural divides? The trust Navarro had shown him, defending him against prejudice and valuing his insights, had become the foundation of his approach to building understanding between different worlds. The confrontation with Mullah Faheem had taught them all about the complexity of conflict and the price of peace. Navarro's final stand had demonstrated that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating an enemy, but from protecting what matters most. The Taliban commander's respect for Navarro, even in their final encounter, spoke to the universal language of honor that transcended their differences. As the group shared stories, their laughter and tears mingling with the setting sun, the impact of Navarro's leadership became clear. He had taught them that true strength lay in unity, that leadership meant serving others, and that courage often meant standing firm in the face of not just physical danger, but moral challenges as well. What made a hero? Was it the grand gestures, the dramatic sacrifices? Or was it the quiet moments of guidance, the unwavering support, the willingness to stand up for what's right? Through their continued service and dedication to others, each member of the unit carried forward different aspects of Navarro's character. Deshaun's commitment to mentoring young soldiers, Doc's dedication to healing both body and spirit, and AJ's work in building bridges between cultures. All these were threads in the tapestry of Navarro's legacy. Even those who had never met him felt his influence through the actions of those he had touched. The sun dipped below the horizon as they prepared to leave, each lost in their own thoughts of how one man's integrity and leadership had shaped their lives. The echoes of Navarro's teachings continued to resonate through their actions, their choices, and their commitment to serving others. In this way, the staff sergeant lived on, his legacy carried forward by those who understood that true heroism lies not in the moments of grand sacrifice, but in the daily choice to stand up for what's right and to lift others up along the way. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.